Greetings once again, my friends, and welcome back to another Drak Vlogs. Now, after the reception of the first episode, I actually decided to change a few things up and start taking a few questions that people have been asking me for quite a while now. And so at that point, I've been advertising that I'm going to be doing a lessons that I learned on YouTube. I'm actually debating whether or not to move that to the end of the year so that at that point I can just have the entire thing, because it was like what I've learned from YouTube so far. And I think it might just be a better idea to move that to the end of the year and go over it all in kind of a multi-episode kind of deal. But there are still some vlogs and some questions that I want to take from you guys. And this one also, like the other with my child, is a question brought up by you guys. Specifically, one of the listeners of the Geek News Reviews and Opinions podcast. And this is a question I've gotten for quite a while now, and it's never really worked out on being able to properly answer it on the podcast. But, well, now I have vlogs, so now I can kind of answer that for you. And that is that even though the podcast has the title News in it, we don't necessarily treat it like, we're insert news network here trying to cover the news. We usually always approach them from kind of a more opinion perspective. And so this brings up the question a lot of, do we actually consider ourselves, or at least in my perspective, do I consider myself a journalist? So first things first, I don't want to speak for any of my other panelists, and if you want to go ask them, go ask them. You can go ask Alex the Shadow Blazer at AlexJShort on Twitter. You can ask Stephen Romney at Romney Reviews. You can ask him there on Twitter, and you can also ask Brenton Volley if you want to at bvolley01 on Twitter. So those are all the Twitter handles. If you want to ask them specifically what they consider themselves to be, I can't answer for them. But I am going to answer for me, because I get this question quite a bit, and I've been getting it since the podcast literally started at my college radio station. Do I actually consider myself a journalist? So let's dive into the meat of that. I kind of have to put in a little bit of a qualifier here. I have technically taken journalism classes. When I was going to college, I was in a radio production class, or in a radio production major. And so in that case, yes, you were taking radio production classes, but you were also taking video production classes and art classes and things like that to keep you very well rounded. Because in this day and age, you can't just be a radio guy. You can't just be a video guy. You have to know at least a little bit of everything to be able to be a viable employee in this kind of field. So that being said, I have taken journalism classes, and I've mentioned it a couple of times on the podcast. Was I the best possible, I was going to say employee, was I the best possible student in there? No, I really wasn't. And that kind of leads into my answer for it. Do I consider myself a journalist? I really don't. I consider myself more of an opinion guy, and I tend to want to go down that direction, especially when it comes to the podcast and when it comes to stories and whatnot. I remember doing the journalism class, and even though, one of the requirements for it was you had to put out a news story that could either be considered by the college paper, or at least it had to be turned into the teacher by once a week, roughly. And there was going to be a deadline for that. And with that class, most of my assignment turn-ins were either reviews or opinion pieces. I think I did one or two that were informative articles. They were not from any kind of perspective or bias. They were just to explain the situation, and it was something very simple, like something going on campus. I think one of them was like the coffee house on campus or something like that. It's been a while. It's been a while since I did those classes, but I did those. But most of my assignments were reviews and opinion pieces, and that actually irritated my instructor to a great extent, because I never tried to tackle the news, and I never tried to tackle it from any kind of biased perspective. And one of the reasons that I didn't was because in my opinion, journalism should be from that perspective. It should be non-biased. It should be informative. Sure, you're going to get, this much information from this given source, but, for every one of us who gets up in the morning and actually wants to know about a situation, we look at it from both perspectives, or multiple perspectives, not even necessarily both. And by both, I mean right and left. So at that point, like, we want to be able to see things from all angles, and that's responsible. That's what you're supposed to do, especially if you've walked into a journalism class, because you do learn very quickly that certain writers and certain journalists will write from their own bias, their own perspective, and their own walk of life. Is that bad? No, not necessarily, but it's one perspective. And that's where it can become a bit of a problem, is that if you only judge or base your opinion on one part of that perspective, or one perspective of that situation, it gets to be somewhat uninformed. And so at that point, I've always approached it that way, and I've always approached news the way that I think it should be written, which is strictly informative. You know, this is the situation as it stands. Here are the facts. Here's the way it goes, and go from there. And in particular, I picked stories that I didn't have an opinion on. I didn't have a bias towards. That's why I took on a coffee house deal. I don't drink coffee. So at that point, I took on stories that didn't necessarily pertain to me so that I could maintain that objectivity. But when it came to the reviews and when it came to the opinion pieces, that's where I wrote a little bit more bias. I'm not going to say that my teacher was happy about that. I tend to not have opinions that people like. So I would occasionally have my own little scuffles with the teacher saying, well, this is my perspective, and you can go ahead and take points off for the fact that I didn't put a comma in the right place. But if you're gonna actually find me for a legitimate opinion, then that's a problem. Because here's the thing, my opinion is strictly my opinion, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm writing right or I'm writing wrong. It just means that I'm writing that way. So we've kind of had a runabout way of it. Like, I have done journalism classes, and I have thankfully passed them. It took a little bit, but I passed them, and I've done my share of reviews and things like that. But I wouldn't consider myself a journalist by any stretch. I actually personally don't have a whole lot of respect for the profession anymore. I have seen a lot of people, or a lot of journalists, a lot of writers, kind of abuse either their position, either their clout, or anything like that, and write the way that they want to. And in some cases, that's very sloppy writing. And I even like my college teacher would agree with me on this. Like, some of that stuff is sloppy writing. Hence why there are certain sources that I don't tend to rely on that much. Me personally, you can like whatever organizations you want. I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. I'm not the biggest fan of Kotaku or Polygon. I will occasionally get stories on the podcast from them, but that's when I know that, I've read the article and it's from a decent writer. If it's from a craptastic writer, I tend to go another direction. I tend to go towards other stories that have been written better and explain more of the facts when we do a story like that. And so at those points, I'm trying to convey this is that I don't have a whole lot of respect for the journalism profession anymore. And I don't consider myself one. I consider myself an opinion guy. I consider myself a guy who's basically just trying to explain his perception of how events go about. Is it right or wrong? Well, in some cases, it's got some logic to it, but I'll admit there have been a few stories where I have been on the wrong end of things, and that's the way that it's gone. But overall, the podcast, even though we have the news part of it on there, it's more to be kind of an opinion show. The way that I've shaped that podcast is more to have a conversation about any given story, not necessarily to just deliver the facts. We do try to deliver the facts as best as we can, or at least as best as we're able to find them, but it's more a conversation kind of show. And that's how I've shaped it. I haven't shaped it necessarily to push an agenda, even though I've seen a few people complain to me that that's exactly what I do. Spoiler alert, no, that's not what I try to do. I try to have a conversation about it, because the bottom line is that, in my opinion, and this has been my opinion since early teenage years, nobody really covers the stories that I want to cover. Nobody covers the geeky stuff unless you have that Geeky Friday radio segment. And so I try to be the guy that's actually doing it. And the other thing I will say is, for all the people who are going to be like, well, G4 did it. Is G4 around anymore? No. Well, that's why, that nobody really wants that. So thankfully to the podcast space, I can do this kind of show, and it makes sense because people will actually listen to it. But to formally answer the question, no, I don't consider myself one. I don't consider the podcast to be a news engine, rather. I consider it to be a place to have a conversation. That's always how I've built any of my podcasts, really. Why We Geek and the Run on the Ropes podcast I run with David Vito, they're just meant to have a conversation. They're not necessarily meant to say, like, you should hate this and here's why. It's more along the lines of, I don't like this and here's why I don't. And then at that point, we can have that conversation, whether it be uncomfortable or whatnot. But I've already kind of gone over this question a couple of times, so I at least wanted to be able to get another blog out to you guys, and I hope that answers it for you. If that doesn't answer it for you, you can go ahead and reach me on Twitter at Drak2326, and maybe I'll try to enlighten it that way. But that's my viewpoint on the matter, and that's how I've kind of shaped the podcast, is that even though news is in there, it's, you know, we share the article, but we don't necessarily look to be, you know, crossfire or anything like that. It's just to have a conversation, not necessarily to say Alex has this side of the argument and Romney has this side of the argument. Go. That's never my case. That's why it's always usually a conversation. Funniest thing, like why we usually kind of end up on the same edge of the spectrum, or however you want to put it. But I hope that answered your question, and that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. So thank you guys so much for continuing to listen, to continue to support the podcast as well as my channel on YouTube. I really do appreciate that. And you guys can look forward to many more vlogs that are going to be coming out in the next little bit. But like I said, the lessons I've learned on YouTube is probably going to get moved to the end of the year, so that at that point I can just do kind of multiple episodes and be able to showcase all of the things that I've learned about YouTube this past year. But yeah, again, thank you guys so much, and I, of course, will be back in time for the next video.